Yeah, so tonight's discussion is on what will socialism look like, and I'll try and give a brief rundown of all of the aspects that run into that. So, if the horrendous events of 2020 to 2021 have proven anything, with millions dead from COVID-19, people's livelihoods destroyed by economic deprivation and collapse, the insurrectionary movements on the streets of the USA sparked by George Floyd's brutal murder and centuries of similar racial oppression, the mass movements in Belarus, Myanmar, and India, with 250 million on strike, the brutal murder of Sarah Everard at the hand of a serving police officer, which ignited a mass movement of people who had experienced similar oppression and those who stood in solidarity, and with the Kill the Bill protests, all of this has proven that something must give. While the 99% are being asked to pay for the crisis, the 1% are amassing wealth at another accelerating pace. The combined wealth of US billionaires passed 2 trillion in gains since March 2020 recently. Amazon have amounted $38 billion in sale in 2020, but paid absolutely no corporation tax. And at the beginning of the pandemic, where it was an increase of 34% on these gains. It's just crazy. The wealth of 650 US billionaires has approached a total of 4 trillion now. And let's remember that all of this is occurring in a country that has seen a crazy high death rate, and in the same country where unemployment reached almost 15% last year. In this same country again, 5% of corporations amount for two-thirds of the national GDP, which is $14 trillion, with an annual revenue of 1 trillion annual profit. These are huge numbers. And it's no coincidence that this vast and frightening inequality occurs in the USA. The USA is the main proponent of an economic system based on profit and profit alone, where the privileged few thrive off the economic and material exploitation of the many. So many argue that capitalism is simply the best way possible, and that humans are innately greedy, and that this is the only way, and that humans have always lived like this. They argue that the free market is the only way of guaranteeing freedom for the individual. If this is the case, why do we live in a world where 26 individuals have the same amount of wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion, and where 6 million children starve every year, where we have enough food for 10 billion? Do those 3.5 billion people have freedom? Does a mother of three in dire poverty in Yemen have the same amount of freedom as Elon Musk? I think not. Can we really work our way up the system? I'd say no. I think social mobility is a myth under capitalism. And to put it in the words of George Orwell, all are equal, although some are clearly more equal than others. So if we want to achieve this materially more equal society, one which runs on human need and not profit, can't we just implement it now? It seems like the logical thing to do. Can't we just put forward these demands in our party and get elected on the program? And if the voting system is stopping us from doing this, can't we just change it to proportional representation and that solve our issues? Well, unfortunately not. Marx outlines in the first chapter of Capital, social being determines consciousness, meaning basically a person's relations or class relations toward another, their material interests, if you like, will be reflected in their actions in society, in their social actions, suggesting that we can radically reorder society just by asking Parliament, like we've already said, is very far-fetched. It's like trying to say that you can win a game of chess, but only in a game where you can move only your own pieces. There's no opposition. Do you really think that those who have massively profited off this system will just hand over their assets and redistribute them equally to solve global inequality? Of course not. There are huge material interests at stake here. Do we really think the likes of Jeff Bezos, who himself owns $193 billion, a fifth of $1 trillion, would give up even a proportion of it? Like, say if he gave up $192.99 billion, which would still leave him as a millionaire, would he give this up? No, of course he wouldn't. We can't simply just try and achieve backdoor socialism. We can't change the name of what we're trying to achieve, as those in power will very quickly recognise and organise against us. We must say it how it is. We are living under not neoliberalism, but the same old horrendous capitalism. And as Jeremy Corbyn once said, the solution at the end of the day is socialism. As soon as we start thinking about how we can, seriously change the world and the changes that are needed, the first thing that comes up against us is this huge brick wall of the state. the police, the judiciary, the courts, the army, all these things. And luckily, Marxism has studied the origins of the state and its relation to class society itself, and subsequently it's unveiled that it is possible to overcome it. And in their works on the state, Marx and Engels sought to unveil the state for what it really is. It's an oppressor of class power, and to demystify it, ridding it of the cloak that capitalism has shrouded it in. So when analysing society through this view, which we'll figure out is historical materialism, we can see that class society hasn't always existed. It's not innate. It's worth quickly analysing the state and its relation to class society to get to the heart of the issue, and therefore realise what is stopping us from realising this socialist society. So for the 97% that modern humans have been around, we've been living in not in class societies. We've been living in with places without monarchies and states, and where we don't have governments and police, etc. So in the Paleolithic era, or what we might call the Lower Stone Age, we lived in very equal societies with no trace of sexism, racism, or oppression of any kind. The efforts of production and distribution were concentrated for the good of the community and not for individual gain. So it's not true that humans have always been innately greedy. It's a construct that has come out of this class society. But it was only when these traveller or these primitive communist societies, as Engels called them, settled down and developed the means of production of agriculture to a sufficient level in which they could produce a surplus that this fairly equal society changed. This surplus value allowed some who produced it to have a profit and subsequently raise themselves above others. And this fundamental aspect of surplus, as this fundamental aspect of surplus began to develop, a class emerged above those creating this value. Under the slave empires of Greece, Rome, and Egypt, this class relation was one of slave to slave owner, the 80% to the 20%. But as this contradiction spiraled out of control and these empires collapsed under their own weight, feudalism arose, where basically a new peasant class were tied to the land, but still essentially slave labourers of the new ruling class. This time, monarchs and noblemen, the 15%. However, as these serfs, these peasants, developed their means of production and distribution further, they were able to create their own surplus by trading it on the new continental markets. And this was the new merchant class arising. This merchant class would ultimately topple the absolute monarchies and the old remnants of feudalism in the bourgeois revolutions of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, where production was owned under private ownership and the 10% from basically the capitalist mode of production. And as capitalism's internal contradictions arose in crisis and uprisings, the market was forced to expand overseas. And this was forced to expand overseas to salvage basically this dying system, which obviously led to imperialism, world war, and globalization, where now you have the 1% and the 99%, where we're basically walking blindly off a cliff towards barbarism and extinction. Let us remember that women's oppression and racial oppression too has its roots in this fundamental economic relation of class. Appearing first as a commodification of women to preserve profit in a man's bloodline, and then the plundering of Africa, Asia, and South America to fuel imperialism in the empire. The state is based on justifying these horrendous contradictions in class society, the violence between the haves and the have-nots. As Engels describes it, the state is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in an insoluble contradiction with itself, that has split itself into two irreconcilable antagonisms which it's powerless to dispel. So this fundamental class relation still remains with us today, of course, this time between the working class and those who rule over us and appropriate our wealth. And one of my favourite ways of describing this is a section from Robert Tressel's fantastic book, The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist. So basically, the character Owen is trying to describe this system, capitalism, in fairly layman terms to his fellow workmen, and he calls it the great money trick. He tells them how things are produced by their labour power being applied to basically natural resources, and then their employer, the capitalist, pays the worker in exchange for this produced commodity Although, however crazy it seems in theory, they never get paid back enough to be able to buy back a significant proportion of what they have produced. Instead, they rely on buying back things from the capitalists for their own survival, for their subsistence. And then, due to them spending this money solely on surviving, they constantly have to work again and again in order to buy back a sufficient amount of these commodities that they have produced, in order to survive. And therefore, the capitalist has produced profit from this surplus value and will remain better off than the worker, despite doing practically no work. From this study, we see that it is impossible to achieve what we want to achieve, which is the radical reordering of society on need and not profit, by simply fiddling around with the current power structure, the current state, and the current status quo. So a quick look at history will demonstrate this. Was the women's vote won because people just politely asked for it? Was homosexuality legalized because people politely asked for it to be? Will the hordes of wealth accumulated by the privileged elite be handed back to those who have created it to create a fairer, greener, more equal society if we simply ask nicely for it? Like we said, no, it won't. The Chartist movement, which was the biggest working class movement in England, has ever seen, it was in the 1840s. And for a decade, they tried to, first they tried to win elections. They got over 6 million signatures on the charter, which they literally carried into Parliament, physically carried it in, asking for what should be considered today quite basic social reforms. They asked for suffrage, they asked for an 8-hour working day, and this was rejected. And the charter slogan was peaceably if we can, and forcibly if we must. And you can see that this peaceful option was met head on with the class power in society, and of course the ruling class weren't willing to give these social reforms back to the workers. So to be a revolutionary is to fight for reforms, but to realise that alone will not be able to deliver the huge changes that are required to solve the tasks ahead. And to be a reformist, on the other hand, or to be a gradualist, is to fight for these reforms, but to reject the need to break with the capitalist system itself. And this is what we're trying to do in Socialist Appeal. We work within the mass organisations of the working class, the Labour Party, the trade unions. We fight for every reform, every gain for the oppressed groups. But we do this whilst maintaining a revolutionary perspective. And that is recognising that the need to break with capitalism itself, not by setting up separate groups on the sidelines and expect the masses to come to us, the objective factors themselves. But, we've put forward our demands, such as the right to recall or Clause 4, which is the party's commitment to socialism, and use these to prove that the current leadership, the current undemocratic nature of the party itself, and the class society that we live in, makes these radical changes absolutely impossible. Whether we have proportional representation or not, or whether we can get voted in, we will try within these organisations. And if we fail to put forward this revolutionary perspective while still embracing these reforms, we fall into what Rosa Luxemburg was countering in Reform or Revolution. She said, "Our programme becomes not the realisation of socialism, but the reform of capitalism, not the suppression of the system of wage labour, but the diminution of exploitation. That is, the suppression of the abuses of capitalism instead of the suppression of capitalism itself." I wish that we could make a fairer, kinder version of capitalism. It would save a lot of time and a lot of effort, but unfortunately, this isn't the case. It's no longer possible, because these symptoms, racism, poverty, sexism, all forms of oppression and climate change won't be rid of until we tackle the tumor that is capitalism itself. These symptoms have their root in class society. The capitalist economy itself is a system which is based on the privileged few, at the expense of the oppressed many. This is why previous attempts to create a fairer and kinder form of capitalism, things like national health services, welfare states, things like Keynesianism, they've ultimately failed and capitulated into the arm of the free market and the capitalist system and its profit base. For the same reason that the Paris Commune failed in 1821, because it failed to tackle the class society and the state itself. You can't prop up a fairer system in a sea of capitalism. It's like trying to, plant a nice camellia plant amongst a sea of ivy. It won't last long. It'll just get, smothered by the ivy. And as with the NHS, a health service free at the point of need, which should surely be a basic aspect of the society in which we can literally send people to the moon, but we can't even achieve this under capitalism. It's crazy. And even after its conception in the late 40s, the NHS, small parts of it were bought off straight away, such as dental care, which was an issue that caused Arnoux and Bevan basically to split with the Labour Party leadership at the time, to the point where the NHS now is literally on the brink of absolute privatisation, where no longer do we have a health service free at the point of need, but instead one in which only those privileged enough to access it can. The same applies to all major struggles we face today, with racism, sexism, poverty, war, and famine. We cannot expect to tackle these oppressive things by simply propping up the solutions alongside a system that's literally based on violence and oppression. We can all agree that one of the biggest problems facing humanity today is the climate crisis and the risk of extinction. In the words of Marx again, capitalism seeks to destroy the two things on which it feeds off: human beings and the environment. In a recent documentary on the BBC, Greta Thunberg travelled to Denmark and interviewed a company which have created technology that can literally reverse climate change by taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But one thing is lacking, which is investment. It would take 8,000 of these machines to reverse the last 20 years of carbon emissions. And the only problem is that they cost billions of dollars, which capitalism does not want to hand over. And again, we see now that we could literally, if we were to fill the Sahara Desert with solar panels, etc., this would be enough energy to basically fuel the whole planet. But we can see that the only thing stopping us from doing this is a system which is based solely on profit. Instead, what our government do is they build coal mines in 2021, proving that their interests don't lie in preserving the planet, but rather lie in preserving profit. Here we see what socialism would look like. It would be a society which is based on human need, one in which one of the main ones is basically investing in our planet. This would be a priority. It would be a priority because the economy would be in the hands of the workers themselves, and it is in everyone's interest to protect the planet with which we live on. We've seen what can be achieved when the world community comes together and concentrates its effort into one plan with the vaccine production, despite it still being full of petty nationalism, which has held it up. Imagine the world scientific community if they came together under sort of democratic, scientific and workers' control, not in the need of profit, but for the sake of ridding, for the sake of finding sort of new cancer treatment and finding the treatment for dementia and improving things like public health on a mass scale. Imagine what could be achieved. Imagine what education would look like, and if the curriculum and teaching were under the control of teachers themselves and under organisations such as the teaching unions, and how much more effective this would have been in providing education for those least advantaged in our communities under COVID. Imagine what we could do to solve global poverty and famine when a food distribution system is based under workers' control and internationalism is the order of the day. No petty nationalist politics, which basically means nothing. The workers of the world have no borders. We have enough food to, like we've already said, we have enough food for 10 billion people on this planet. We produce that. Yet 6 million children starve every year. It is this superabundance from the surplus value that's created under capitalism for profit that under socialism would be used to distribute equally the collective fruits of human society. And it is this dialectical relationship between the two. It turns into its opposite under socialism. It becomes a beneficial thing. When we have a planned economy under democratic workers' control, not left to the anarchy of the market, we can seriously tackle these huge problems that are facing us. When people aren't working, 5 days a week and sort of struggling to fit anything in the evening because they're so knackered. When women are freed from domestic labour and childcare, and these tasks are made social and put into the community, allowing people to engage in the direct democratic control over their lives and the economy, freeing up more time for the arts and hobbies and the development of human civilization itself. We don't have to imagine it though. The unions, the labour movement, the community organising groups that were formed in the BLM protests in the summer, our workplaces themselves, our protests and our interaction with each other, our social labour and our communities. That is what socialism is. It already exists in the current system, but just held back by capitalism. Socialism isn't just a nice idea. It exists out of necessity of the vast contradictions in the capitalist system itself. We aren't idealists. We're not crystal ball glazers that dream up a new perfect society in our minds. No, socialism will evolve materially out of necessity in a system where the technology, like we have seen and like we have said, to solve global issues like climate change is available. The means of production and distribution are capable of solving global poverty and hunger, and they are very much developed. And the only thing that is holding them back is the profit-driven world that we live under, or the supposedly free market. The only thing that we have capitalism to thank for is that it's made socialism possible. The seed of the new society exists in the bud of the old. And in that sense, we are materialists. Now, as we have seen above, the objective conditions are very much evolving before our eyes. Capitalism is at its deepest ever crisis, with global debt amounting to 100% of international GDP, and countries having to invest $15 trillion to prop up a system which is dying. As Lenin said, the revolutionary situation is very much upon us. There is a crisis and a split in the ruling class, such as the splits in the monarchy and the Tory party, where they have created a system so oppressive that they just have to resort to more and more authoritarian means to justify it, such as the recent police bill. And this increased reaction, combined with the harsh economic and social reality for working class people and other oppressed groups, are faced with, this puts revolution on the table. This is what does it. And the objective necessity for socialism is arriving. These huge social movements are erupting on a global scale as many people seek to answer the world's inequality and look up, questioning the few. These social movements are exactly that. They are social, stemming from social and economic relations in society, which, yes, Margaret Thatcher does in fact exist. Therefore, with the introduction of the recent policing bill and with the banning of anti-capitalist material in secondary schools is extremely naive. The ruling class of our current times surely aren't as clever as they once were. As we've discussed, these movements don't just emerge because people think it's a good idea or it would be cool to have socialism. No, they arrive as the lived expression or material experience of oppression under capitalism. And therefore, where there is capitalism, there will be a need to overthrow it. Where there is this bill, whether there is this bill or whether we learn about capitalism in school or not, capitalism, in the words of Marx, creates its own gravediggers, a class of people so oppressed that they seek to overthrow the system that oppresses them. The question is, however, will we, the subjective factor, be there to direct this movement to socialism? Or will we leave it to barbarism, like Rosa Luxemburg so poignantly said, when the failed socialist revolution in 1918 ultimately paved the way for fascism in the 1930s? Do we fight the suppression of capitalism systems, or do we rid ourselves of the disease completely? Should we just fight the symptoms themselves, or should we fight racism at its root? Should we fight women's oppression at its root? Should we end homophobia, xenophobia, and transphobia? Should we end war, poverty, and inequality? In short, we should fight for socialism. This cures all of these things. And to quote Rosa Luxemburg for a third time for good luck, every generation of revolutionaries fails but the last. And I'd say our job and our duty to our children and to our grandchildren is to make sure that we are indeed that last. Let's see socialism in our lifetime.